You smell it before you see her. It slinks through the air like a curse, thick, humid, unholy. Not the scent of sweat or dirt, but something older. Something sour and human and slow. You taste it on your tongue. You feel it settle on your skin. The torches flicker as she passes, not from wind, but from the collective breath no one dares to release. You are standing in the great hall of Castile. Gold-lined tapestries drape the walls. Saints stare down from stone alcoves. Choirboys sing in the distance, their voices thin and hollow. Yet the grandeur means nothing. Because she is approaching. And with her comes the stench of something no one is allowed to name. Her footsteps are slow, but deliberate. Each one echoes too long. She is cloaked in silk, stitched with the symbols of conquest, crosses, lions, swords, but none of it shines. The fabric hangs stiff, as if wet beneath the surface. Beneath her robes, there is something else. A second skin. A layer of fabric that has not left her flesh in nearly a decade. The chemise. The first time you hear the word, it sounds harmless. A simple linen shift worn next to the skin. But this one, hers, is different. It is the same piece she wore 10 years ago, on the day she vowed before her priests, her generals, and her God that she would not remove it until Granada fell. That vow has not been broken. And neither has the seal of silence surrounding it. The courtiers know. The physicians know. The servants who must stand within arm's reach, who cough at night, whose skin burns from unseen things, they all know. But no one speaks. Because the queen is the war. And the war is not yet won. She passes you. And in that moment, you understand why people speak of her in the same breath as famine and fire. The air warps around her. There is no perfume strong enough. No prayer long enough. The rod is not just of the body, it is of purpose, of obsession made flesh. Once, she was called Isabella the Catholic. Now, they call her nothing. Not to her face. Not where anyone might hear. You've heard the rumors, haven't you? That her body is peeling beneath the cloth. That sores never close. That parasites move beneath the surface of her skin. That sometimes, when she kneels to pray, her gown sticks to the floor, and must be peeled up by hand. And still, she smiles. A pale, quiet thing. Eyes like iron. Hands folded in divine certainty. She does not hide what she has become. She believes it is holy. And in the silence of the court, as lungs fill with the scent of ruin, everyone nods in reverence. Because what she wears is not just cloth. It is punishment. It is penance. It is prophecy. And if you say otherwise, if you so much as flinch, you may not return tomorrow. So you stay silent. You bow lower. And you try not to breathe. Before the rot, there was a kingdom already splitting at the seams. You must imagine a land without Spain, a place fractured by swords and faith. The 15th century Iberian Peninsula was not one nation, but a collision of worlds. Walled cities, desert palaces, burning fields. There were Christian kingdoms clawing for dominance. Muslim emirates clinging to the last edge of power. And in between, traders, poets, philosophers, Jews who had called this land home for over 1,000 years. It was a place of uneasy coexistence. A place where cathedrals stood across the street from mosques, where Arabic prayers echoed through Christian streets, and where Jewish scholars translated ancient texts for kings who would later burn them. For a moment in history, the peninsula breathed a strange, tense harmony, an empire suspended in contradiction. But behind every harmony, there is a hunger. And soon, the hunger for purity began to rise. They called it limpieza de sangre, cleanliness of blood. It did not mean righteousness. It meant exclusion. It meant heritage. It meant that to be truly Christian, you could not merely believe, you had to inherit. Your grandfather's baptism was not enough. His blood had to be clean. Not Jewish. Not Muslim. Not touched by any infidel line. This was not faith. This was doctrine as blade. And it would become the most dangerous idea in Europe. You trace the roots of that obsession to one child. Isabella of Castile. She was not born into power. She was born into the tremble just before a throne falls. Civil war racked the court. Succession was chaos. Her half-brother reigned with instability and indulgence, while Isabella was hidden, raised in the shadow of monasteries. And it was there, in those cold stone halls, that something grew in her. A silence. A tightness. A need to cleanse. The confessor was her world. The sermons, her lullabies. She learned early that to suffer was to please God, and that to deny herself pleasure was to gather heavenly favor. At 8, she was fasting. At 12, she walked barefoot through snow during Lent. By 14, she had begun flagellating herself in secret. When you look at the woman she became, you must also look at the child who thought God smiled when she bled. She was not taught to govern. She was taught to kneel. And when the time came to rise, she rose with terrifying precision. Her marriage was not for love. It was war made domestic. Ferdinand of Aragon, a prince as cunning as he was devout. Their union did not seal a love story. It sealed a national conquest. Two crowns becoming one, not in affection, but in strategy. A chessboard moved by iron-fingered bishops and whispering counselors. Together, they would not just rule, they would purify. It was not enough to unify the land. They had to unify the soul. And Isabella believed the soul of Spain was under siege. You can see it in her early decrees. In the men she surrounded herself with. In the sermons she requested at court. She did not seek tolerance. She sought conversion. She did not question whether difference could coexist, she questioned why it should exist at all. The queen who would one day rot beneath her own vow was already rotting from within. The idea of penance had become identity. Her bloodline was her sanctity. Her pain, her power. This is the womb of the plague. Not the disease of body, but of belief. Because once a ruler decides that cleansing the body politic means purging real human blood, there is no end but fire. And Spain was about to burn. If you're still here, still watching, still listening, then ask yourself this: if you had stood in that court, smelled that silence, heard that vow, would you have bowed? Or would you have looked away? If you still have the strength to look, subscribe to Cursed Chronicles. If you don't, go to the comments and confess why. It was not armor. It was not steel. It was linen, thin, white, and silent. A chemise. In the 15th century, it was the garment closest to the body. A layer between skin and silk, between flesh and God. For most, it was changed often, sometimes daily if they were rich, or once a week at the very least. The peasants had little, but even they would scrape soap to cleanse their linen when they could. Sweat, rot, and filth were seen as invitations to illness. Even the poor feared what festered near the skin. But Isabella made it holy. They say it happened in 1482, just before the final campaign for Granada. The banners were raised. The court was gathered. The war for the last Muslim stronghold in Iberia was to begin. And the queen, cloaked in her favorite white chemise, stood before her court and made a vow. That she would not change the garment touching her skin until Granada fell. Not for a day. Not for a year. Not for however long it would take to grind a kingdom into ash. The silence that followed was not reverent, it was stunned. But no one opposed her. Not the bishops. Not the nobles. Not the king. Because to challenge a vow made before God, was to invite damnation. At first, they believed it was symbolic. They assumed she would bathe in secret, change the chemise under cover of darkness. That the queen would never truly bind herself to such a grotesque ritual. But weeks passed. Then months. And the linen remained. Beneath her gowns, beneath her coronets, beneath the weight of a growing war, something was happening. The chemise, once white as snow, began to yellow. Then brown. Then darker still. Sweat became stain. Blood became crust. Bodily oils formed patches that glistened under torchlight. What began as discomfort turned to pain. What began as pain, became infection. Court physicians, forbidden from speaking openly, began writing letters in veiled terms. They referred to the Queen's divine penance, but beneath the praise were quiet phrases, unclosing wounds, skin that no longer breathes, corruptions of the lower flesh. It was their way of documenting what they could not say, that the Queen was dying from the outside in. Her skin blistered beneath the fabric. Constant friction tore open sores that never had time to close. Bacteria, invisible and endless, found home in every crevice. Parasites, lice, mites, worms, fed on the warmth of rotting cloth and unwashed skin. And still, she refused to change it. She would sit for counsel with her hands folded calmly on her lap, while beneath the table her thighs wept from lesions. Her neck grew stiff. Her back itched constantly, until she bled from scratching too hard. And when the chemise dried against the wounds, she did not flinch. Because in her mind, this was sacred. She believed that every new infection was another coin in heaven's ledger. Every rash, every boil, every stench was proof of her suffering. Of her faithfulness. By the third year, the garment had stiffened. It no longer flowed, it cracked when she moved. In places, it began to fuse with her flesh. Cloth merged with wound. The fabric, soaked through with years of fluids, had begun to rot on a molecular level. It was no longer clothing. It was scab. Shell. Shroud. Myth and medicine blur here. Some accounts claim it was peeled from her skin with tongs after the war, tearing muscle with it. Others say parts of it were never removed. That it was buried with her. That the cathedral still holds it in secret. A relic no priest dares to name. There were days when the Queen could no longer sit without wincing. But she never complained. When asked how she bore the pain, she would murmur, "God has endured worse." And yet, her body told a different story. She began to tremble. Her breath grew thin. Her immune system, battered by the constant siege of rot, could not defend itself. Minor illnesses became months-long fevers. Scratches turned septic. The smallest cough from a servant could unravel her. But no one spoke the truth. Because her suffering had become a symbol. And in her presence, symbols were more real than wounds. It is said that her ladies-in-waiting developed skin conditions just by dressing her. That 2 midwives fell ill with fever and never recovered. That servants who laundered her outer garments wore masks soaked in vinegar to ward off the invisible corruption that clung to her presence. But none dared say she was unclean. Because what do you call a saint, when her holiness reeks? And what do you do, if you're watching this, still silent, still listening, but you haven't subscribed? Then maybe you are no different from the courtiers who bowed through the stench. Do not stay silent. Join Cursed Chronicles. Or go to the comments and confess why the truth repulses you. The court of Castile did not scream. It did not protest. It did not flee. It endured. Because that was the only thing left to do. Day after day, the Queen appeared, wrapped in silks, pearls along her throat, lips pursed in eternal resolve. And day after day, the ones who served her sank deeper into a ritual of quiet suffering. Their eyes red from incense. Their throats scratched by smoke. Their faces frozen in devotion. But beneath it all was a rot that no mask could hide. The Queen's chemise had become a monument of filth. Her garments, layered above it, absorbed the overflow, one cloth feeding the next like a wound that would not clot. And those who came near her, felt it. The air shifted. The temperature changed. It clung to you, even after you left her chambers. It lived in your hair, your skin, your lungs. The ladies in waiting, the ones who had once giggled in the halls and hummed while they brushed her hair, began to fall sick. Quietly at first. Dizziness. Nausea. Skin rashes that turned to welts. Some fainted while helping her dress, overwhelmed by the closeness, the heat, the smell. They were not dismissed. They were silenced. Their duties were reassigned. Their symptoms labeled melancholy or devotional fatigue. A few disappeared. Sent to remote convents for spiritual recovery. But everyone knew the truth. And yet, still, no one spoke it. Because the queen had become untouchable. Not by law. Not by rank. But by myth. The priests, those most trusted by her, whispered of her suffering as sacred. They called it the odor of sanctity. They quoted scripture, "The righteous shall bear the pain of the flesh for the glory of the Lord." They said her sores were signs of purification. That her chemise, rotting and raw, was a vestment of divine warfare. Some even wept in her presence, overcome not by stench, but by what they claimed was holy awe. But the servants wept for different reasons. In the lower halls of the palace, there was a black market trade, not in gold or jewels, but in incense. Merchants who once sold cloth and spices now dealt in frankincense, myrrh, dried lavender, and blocks of perfumed resin. Candles soaked in clove oil. Charcoal pucks laced with camphor. Incense burners carved into sacred shapes. The incense economy, they called it. Burned endlessly in chambers where the queen was expected to appear. Lit hours before council meetings. Packed beneath thrones, inside hollow table legs, behind tapestry folds. Wherever her scent might linger, fire was fed in fear. It wasn't to honor her. It was to survive her. Diplomats who traveled from foreign courts quickly learned the ritual. Some arrived prepared, bringing their own bombs and scented cloths. Others returned home before business was done, citing illness, plague fears, or courtly offense. One Venetian ambassador wrote in code to his doge, "The Queen of Castile is a woman of terrible devotion. Her holiness chokes the lungs." The English sent envoys with cloths soaked in rose oil, pressed discreetly to their faces during audiences. The French whispered that Castile was ruled not by a woman, but by a ghost wrapped in linen. But no formal complaint was ever made. Because even kings would not risk offending the Catholic queen. Within her own walls, courtiers developed their own etiquette of survival. No one turned their face away. No one winced. No one coughed. They learned to nod slower, to blink less, to tilt their heads just enough to breathe from the side. They adjusted their stance so the wind from the windows might carry the scent away from them. They timed their breath, inhale when she speaks, exhale when she turns. It became part of court training. And if someone failed, if a servant stumbled, or a noble recoiled even slightly, there were consequences. Not always spoken. But swift. Dismissal. Reassignment. Public shaming masked as divine punishment. Because acknowledgement was betrayal. Everyone knew. But no one spoke. Not the maids scrubbing linens that would never be clean. Not the guards who held their breath until they fainted. Not the scribes who documented decrees with tears in their eyes from smoke that burned more than just paper. Because silence was the only thing that kept you safe. And the queen? She noticed. She always noticed. But she said nothing. Because fear was loyalty. And suffering was loyalty. And silence was the crown she wore beneath the one of gold. And if you're still watching, still here, still breathing, then you've seen what they saw. You've stood in that room. You've smelled that lie. So ask yourself, are you one of them? Silent, nodding, obedient? Or will you speak where others didn't? Subscribe to Cursed Chronicles. Or go to the comments and explain why silence suits you better. Granada should have fallen in a year. Its walls were aging. Its treasury drained. The Nasrid dynasty, long splintered by infighting, could barely hold its court together, let alone mount a meaningful defense against the unified kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. The Christian armies outnumbered them. They had more steel, more gold, more allies. The outcome was never in question. And yet, it dragged on. 1 year became 2. Then 5. Then 10. The final siege of Granada was not a war of strategy, it was a war of will. And at the center of that will stood a woman who believed her body was a battlefield, and her suffering was a weapon. Isabella's obsession with divine victory infected every part of the campaign. The soldiers marched in her name, yes, but they also whispered in tents at night. They spoke of their queen not as a woman, but as a prophecy with breath. A holy curse that walked among them. She would arrive at the front dressed not in armor, but in embroidered robes layered over the rotting chemise. She gave sermons beside the catapults. She prayed while men bled out on the dirt beside her. And she refused, absolutely refused, to let the siege end through negotiation or diplomacy. There were Muslim emissaries who begged for terms. Who offered gold, tribute, submission. But Isabella would not hear it. Granada was not to be surrendered, it was to be cleansed. She believed that God had granted her a sacred role. That only through total conquest, through the raising of mosques and the baptism of every soul, would her vow be fulfilled. She saw herself not as queen, but as executioner of divine justice. And in her mind, mercy was rebellion. But her body was betraying her. By the 6th year of the siege, she could no longer sit through full war councils. She would shift in her seat, her face tight with pain, sores on her legs reopening beneath the pressure of her own weight. The chemise had stiffened into armor, not of metal, but of wrought. Some days, she was wheeled in on a covered litter. On others, she stood trembling, gripping the back of a chair, delivering edicts through clenched teeth. No one dared comment on the odor. But it seeped into the tents. Into the soil. Into the stories. The troops, exhausted, sick, underpaid, began to fear her more than they feared the enemy. Morale collapsed. Deserters vanished in the night, their absence never spoken of. And those who stayed grew thin with doubt. For every man who kissed his crucifix before battle, another muttered prayers that the queen herself would stay far from the front. She had become too much. Too sacred to question. Too diseased to endure. Even the Muslim defenders in the city began to speak of her differently. At first, she was mocked as a woman out of place. Then feared as a leader without mercy. And then, mythologized as something more. Rumors spread across Granada's walls, that she had given her soul to a saint and her body to rot. That her very breath carried contagion. That no plague touched her army because the disease had already taken her. Some said she did not eat. That she drank only wine soaked with ash. That her wounds never closed because God himself kept them open. They called her La Reina Podrida, the rotting queen. To the defenders of Granada, Isabella was not just a queen. She was a symbol of divine pestilence. A figure from prophecy. A force sent not to conquer, but to unmake. And in this, they were not wrong. Because the siege itself had become her reflection. It was no longer a battle for territory, it was a ritual. A prolonged rite of violence, purification through fire and famine. Towns were razed not for strategy, but for spectacle. Water supplies were poisoned. Fields salted. Churches raised beside the ashes of mosques, still smoking. What could have ended with a treaty, became a slow-motion crucifixion. A decade-long bleeding of an entire city, because one woman believed that pain was the only path to salvation. And all the while, the chemise remained. Unchanged. Unwashed. A relic of her defiance. A second skin that grew darker with each passing season. It no longer needed to be seen to be known. Its presence preceded her. Like the fog before a plague ship. Like the shadow before the reaper. This war didn't have to last 10 years. But obsession turned it into rot. If you're obsessed with the truth, if you refuse to blink when history turns monstrous, subscribe to Cursed Chronicles. If not, go to the comments and tell us why you'd rather pretend history was clean. Granada fell on the 2nd day of January, 1492. The banners were raised. The bells tolled across Castile. The city, once a jewel of Islamic civilization, was surrendered to the Christian crown. Its people, architects, scholars, merchants, children, lined the streets in silence, watching as their world passed into shadow. And at the center of the procession, was her. Isabella. Too weak to walk unaided. Her chemise had begun to fuse to her back, its fibers tangled into her wounds. The attendants who tried to lift her described the fabric as stiff and wet, like dried hide left too long in the rain. It tore when they moved her. Not just cloth, but skin. Her feet barely touched the ground. Her body was a ruin. But her eyes burned. Because she believed this moment, was worth every infection, every boil, every breath soaked in pain. Granada had fallen. Her vow had been fulfilled. But victory did not bring healing. Her body, long ravaged by disease, began to collapse inwards. Fever returned. The wounds would not close. Physicians worked in silence, treating her in secret chambers, wrapping her limbs in wine-soaked bandages. They whispered of sepsis. Of rot that would not stop. She could no longer sit for long. Her appetite vanished. She slept less and screamed more. And yet, even then, she did not rest. 3 months after the fall of Granada, a new decree was written in her name. Signed with a hand that trembled so violently it had to be steadied by another. The Alhambra Decree. Every Jew in Spain was given a choice: convert to Christianity, or leave the kingdom within 3 months. No possessions. No wealth. No protections. It did not matter how long they had lived there. It did not matter how many had fought beside her armies. It did not matter if they had served her crown for generations. Faith was no longer enough. Blood had to be clean. Tens of thousands fled. Others converted, publicly. Secretly, many held on to the traditions of their ancestors, praying in basements, whispering songs into cloth. But the crown had already laid the foundation for something worse. The Inquisition. It had been formalized years earlier, but now, it rose with fury. No longer a tool of investigation, it became a machine of purification. Rooms filled with iron. Pulleys. Hooks. Braziers. Screams. The auto da fe, the act of faith, became a public ritual. Heretics paraded through city squares. Forced confessions. The smell of burning flesh mingled with holy chants. Children watched as parents were stripped and scourged. The people learned that silence was safer than mercy. That suspicion was contagious. That the church was watching. And Isabella? She attended. Even in illness, even when she could barely sit upright, she was brought to the burnings. Propped on cushions. Dressed in fresh linen that hid the corrupted one beneath. Her skin oozed through the layers, and still she smiled as flames rose before her. This, she believed, was cleansing. This, she believed, was the final act of her vow. Because once her body had been offered, the next step was the kingdom itself. Every impure soul. Every memory of other gods. Every voice that whispered in a tongue not born of the cross. The rot had moved beyond her skin. It had become law. And beneath it, Spain convulsed. The confiscation of Jewish wealth flooded the royal treasury. Entire communities stripped of gold, land, art. These riches, taken in the name of God, were used to fund a voyage. A man named Columbus stood before her, maps in hand, dreams in his eyes. He would sail west, into unknown waters, to find salvation in spice and conquest. Isabella approved the journey. And the coins he carried into the Atlantic had been pulled from the mouths of the exiled. This was the paradox that ruled her final years. A queen rotting from devotion, preaching purity while soaked in disease. A woman who spoke of holiness while her skin peeled from her bones. Who demanded spotless faith while she wore the same linen that stank of every sin the body could leak. She had become the symbol of Spain. Not its glory. Its guilt. She lit fires in every direction, flesh, faith, fear, and declared it justice. She could not cleanse her own body, so she burned the bodies of others. She could not heal her own wounds, so she made wounds sacred. The chemise had been a private vow. But now, the whole nation was wearing it. Stained with blood. Stuck to skin. Unable to be removed. This was not about power anymore. It was about rot mistaken for righteousness. If you're still here, it means you can feel the heat of those flames. You can smell what they tried to hide. So ask yourself, why wouldn't you subscribe to Cursed Chronicles? Or tell us in the comments, why the fire doesn't bother you anymore. Her vow had been fulfilled. Granada had fallen. The fires had been lit. Heretics silenced, exiled, buried beneath ash. But the queen did not rise triumphant from her sacrifice. She limped forward, breath by breath, body failing, mind calcifying. The wounds left by her chemise, some physical, others far less visible, never closed. And they did not end with her. They multiplied. They spread. They became Spain. Inside the palace, her family decayed in her shadow. Her daughter, Joanna, bright, sensitive, devout, began to unravel. Those closest to her whispered that the girl had inherited something more than her mother's crown. She had inherited the rot. Joanna spoke to absent figures in the dark. She wept at night, refused to eat for days, screamed during Mass. When her husband died, she cradled his corpse in bed for nights, refusing to release him. The court would label her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. But madness doesn't sprout from nothing. It festers in the soil it's planted in. And Isabella had tended the soil with blood. She herself had suffered multiple miscarriages. Children born early, sick, or silent. The physicians could not explain it, but those who handled her laundry knew. Her chemise had stained every cradle before a child touched it. What should have been a mother's comfort became an infection passed from womb to tomb. The dynasty weakened. The succession twisted. Political marriages became traps. Sons died young. Daughters broke. The royal lineage, so carefully crafted, so obsessively cleansed, was riddled with instability. And beyond the palace walls, the kingdom began to fracture beneath the weight of her sanctified obsession. The war had cost more than blood. Spain, though unified in name, was bleeding internally. The long campaigns, the endless purges, the expulsions, all demanded silver, iron, and grain. So the crown took. From artisans. From farmers. From families who had lived on the land for generations. Entire cities were emptied of Jews and Muslims, communities that once brought medicine, architecture, poetry, commerce. Their homes were sealed. Their books burned. Their banks raided. Their tools left behind, rusting under foreign hands who didn't know how to use them. The economic collapse was quiet at first. Grain prices rose. Trade slowed. Shipments failed to return. But the Queen's court did not see this. They saw only clean maps and cleaner names. Cities renamed. Mosques whitewashed. Streets wiped of memory. The silence, they believed, was purity. But in silence, nothing grows. Even science, withered. The Spain that once welcomed Jewish astronomers and Muslim surgeons now shut its gates to inquiry. Questions became crimes. Curiosity was heresy. The Inquisition had taught the nation that doubt was a wound. And no one dared reopen it. Artists were ordered to paint the queen in radiant light. Youthful. Strong. Her hands clasped, her expression serene. But they knew. They all knew. The real Isabella could barely stand without assistance. Her limbs trembled under silks. Her breath rattled behind jewels. Her face was a map of infection. Her chemise, still there, still fused, still hidden, was bleeding into every canvas, every coin, every corridor of the kingdom. Truth had become treason. Spain, like its queen, was learning how to rot with dignity. Isabella's vow outlived her. Her rot became royal policy. If this disgusts you, let it move you. Don't look away like the nobles did. Subscribe to Cursed Chronicles, or tell us in the comments why ignorance is more comfortable. Centuries have passed. The queen is long dead. Her chemise, if it survived, lies hidden in some cloistered vault, or was buried in secrecy beneath layers of earth and reverence. Her bones rest in an ornate tomb, carved in marble, guarded by candles and myth. But her story has not decayed. It lingers. And where incense once smothered the air, microscopes now peer through it. Modern science has begun to exhume the silence. Historians, microbiologists, and forensic specialists, armed not with incense or scripture, but with swabs, spectrometers, and ultraviolet light, have turned their attention to the relics of her court. Garments, wood fragments from chamber furniture, the fabric of pillows once used to prop her failing body upright. Traces of biological material remain, residue long dormant, but not erased. Under the microscope, the past begins to breathe again. They find evidence of Staphylococcus aureus, a bacteria known for burrowing into open skin, festering beneath scabs, thriving in warmth and moisture. They find markers of lice-borne infections, parasites that flourish in woven linen worn without change. Some samples suggest resistant strains, the kind that adapt to survive the endless reapplication of herbal salves, the prayers, the perfumes. None of it worked. And yet the rot wasn't only physical. It ran deeper, into the psyche. Her confessor's journals speak in riddles, but modern psychologists read between the lines. The queen who refused to bathe. Who refused to change. Who refused to yield. Obsession disguised as devotion. Ritual masking disorder. The repetition. The fixation on purity. The refusal to allow any deviation. The need to suffer, endlessly, as proof of righteousness. Modern diagnoses hover behind the veil, obsessive-compulsive disorder. Religious delusional syndrome. Self-mortification as compulsion. Isabella wasn't merely devout. She was devoured. Letters between court physicians hint at their helplessness. They wrote of unresolvable afflictions. Of pains that defied our prayers. Of flesh that would not cleanse. But they did not treat her. They worshipped her suffering. Because to suggest she was unwell, would be to unmask the entire kingdom's foundation. And in language, the rot became immortal. During her reign, the vocabulary of Spain shifted. Words emerged that had never existed before: santidad pestilent, pestilent sanctity. Gracia corrompida, corrupted grace. El perfume de la cruz, the scent of the cross. These weren't metaphors. They were defenses. Rationalizations. How do you speak of a queen whose holiness smells of decay? You invent new words to make it sound sacred. And long after her death, those words lingered. Because Isabella's decay became not just policy, not just portraiture, but ideology. She ruled not only as monarch, but as symbol. And symbols are rarely allowed to decompose. Historians have drawn disturbing lines between her reign and the figures that came after. Cult leaders who demanded their followers fast to the point of collapse. Despots who punished their people in the name of purity. Regimes that burned books, bodies, and histories to preserve a false ideal of perfection. You see the pattern. A single person declares themselves sacred. Their sickness becomes law. Their pain becomes theater. And the crowd watches in silence, unsure if they're witnessing sacrifice or suicide. Isabella was not the first. She was not the last. But she may be one of the clearest examples of how madness, when clothed in ritual, can infect a nation. Her chemise, rotting, sacred, forbidden, was never just cloth. It was a metaphor for a kingdom too afraid to wash itself. And if you've come this far, through smoke and silence, through history's darkest corridors, then you've seen what they tried to hide. You've stared into the infection they called faith. So subscribe to Cursed Chronicles, if you still believe truth deserves light. And if not, go to the comments, and tell us why myth still smells sweeter than reality. In her final months, the queen vanished. Not from power, no. Her decrees still flowed from behind heavy doors. Her seal still marked executions. Her name still crowned every edict like the cross on a tombstone. But her body, the body that had been exalted for a decade as the vessel of Spain's purification, was hidden away. She no longer appeared in public. No more processions. No more councils. No more audiences with nobles or foreign kings. Only incense. Endless incense. Her chambers were transformed into a temple of denial. Curtains soaked in rosewater. Charcoal braziers burning clove and cinnamon. Priests posted at her bedside, not to comfort, not to question, but to sanctify. They murmured prayers even in sleep. Lit candles in every corner. Some wept at the scent that filled the room, not from grief, but from what they called holy presence. But beneath the veil of ritual, the truth could not be kept still. The chemise, her vow made flesh, had fused so completely to her skin that every motion tore something open. Her shoulders were raw. Her thighs blistered. Her back was a lattice of infected scabs and reopened lesions. Each attempt to treat her was an act of violence. Her attendants used shears to separate fabric from flesh. Some days they had to soak her in wine and herbs for hours just to loosen the edges. And still, when they pulled, the skin came too. The physicians, though forbidden from speaking openly, left behind fragments, letters, notes hidden in treatises on unrelated illnesses. In one, the smell is described as the scent of martyrdom itself, unspeakable, but endured. In another, they speak of a woman hallowed by her own holiness. She bled through every dressing. She cried out, but never begged for relief. Because to break the vow, even in death, was to undo everything. And the church knew it. As her body decayed, the machinery of sainthood began to turn. Clergy were summoned not to prepare last rites, but to preserve legend. Chroniclers were instructed to write of her iron devotion. Pain was rewritten as ecstasy. Infection became spiritual proof. Her sores were likened to stigmata. Her silence during agony, proof of divine endurance. They called her chosen. They said she had suffered more than any woman since the Virgin herself. Outside the palace walls, the fires had not stopped. The Inquisition was still grinding bones in its holy furnace. New burnings were scheduled even as the queen gasped for breath. Converts were tortured for failing to cross themselves correctly. Children were interrogated. Families disappeared. And yet, within her perfumed tomb, they said the queen was at peace. Not because she was healing. But because she was complete. She had become what she believed Spain must be, purged, bled, sanctified. She did not ask for healing. She did not ask for comfort. She did not ask to be remembered as a woman. She wanted to be remembered as a wound the nation chose to worship. And she was. Even today, you can see her statue outside cathedrals, eyes cast to heaven, hands folded in prayer. Not a trace of rot. Not a stain on her robe. The chemise, of course, is never mentioned. But it was there. At her death. At her burial. At the birth of a Spain that would carry her illness for generations. If you followed her to this point, into the chamber where incense cannot hide the truth, then you already understand why we tell these stories. Subscribe to Cursed Chronicles, or go to the comments and explain why you'd rather let saints stay spotless, even when their skin was falling away. They never displayed it. No glass case. No shrine. No reliquary framed in gold. The chemise, the queen's second skin, soaked in 10 years of sweat, infection, and holy obsession, disappeared the moment she died. Some say it was buried with her, sealed in silence beneath layers of silk and stone. Others claim it was destroyed by her ladies-in-waiting, burned in secret before the cloth could bear witness against the legend being written. But it didn't matter. The chemise was already a relic. Not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. To some, it became a story of sacred devotion. A symbol of divine discipline. The queen who bore her people's sins in silence. The monarch who wore suffering like a crown. The saint who bled quietly for the birth of a Christian empire. To others, it became a horror. The rot that ruled. The silence that killed. The story of how a single woman's obsession seeped into the walls of cathedrals, the bodies of children, the flames of 1,000 pyres. It was not a garment. It was a warning. But warnings, when painted in gold, are often mistaken for glory. Because Isabella did not simply die. She echoed. Her faith, shaped in cloisters and calcified in fever, became the moral framework of a generation. Monarchs after her looked not to her policies, but to her pain. Her grandson, Charles V, ruled with a sword in one hand and a crucifix in the other, believing, as she had, that divine favor was purchased through torment. That conquest was proof of righteousness. That mercy was weakness. They built empires in her name. And those empires bled the world. What began in Granada spread to the Americas. Indigenous peoples baptized by fire. Languages erased. Cultures starved. Heretics named in foreign tongues. The Inquisition, no longer confined to Spain, was exported, across oceans, across jungles, across deserts. Torture chambers became galleons. Whips traded for muskets. Confession for conquest. The global Inquisition wore armor. And behind its visor was the same unblinking gaze of a queen who never changed her linen. You can walk the streets of Madrid today and still see her. Carved in stone. Cast in bronze. Staring down from cathedral domes and palace gates. Always serene. Always composed. The mother of Spain. The woman who gave Columbus his sails. Who unified a nation. Who brought order from chaos. But none of those statues mention the sores beneath the silk. None speak of the linens peeled from rotting flesh. None tell of the incense burned not for worship, but to cover decay. They don't need to. Because her legacy isn't in the statues. It's in the silence. In every history book that praises her crown but skips her chemise. In every sanitized monument that elevates empire but forgets the bodies beneath it. In every ritual that teaches children to kneel, but never to ask why. She taught a kingdom to suffer and call it sacred. And when a nation forgets how to question suffering, it does not heal, it inherits. This is how rot becomes law. This is how linen becomes legend. This is how one woman's vow outlives her, pressed into generations like blood into fabric. And so the chemise remains, not in glass, but in memory. Invisible. Immovable. Still clinging to a body long gone, still shaping a world that never stopped bowing to the wrong gods. If you've made it here, if you've seen what lies beneath the lace and the legend, then don't leave in silence. Subscribe to Cursed Chronicles. And if you won't, tell us in the comments why the truth still makes you look away. The court is still. The incense has long gone cold. The braziers extinguished. The chants silenced. But the air is not clean. You see her, just as you did at the beginning. Sitting in a high-backed chair carved from black walnut, hands folded, spine stiff despite the tremble in her shoulders. The chemise, hidden beneath layers of velvet and jewels, clings like a final breath. Her crown is crooked. Her mouth closed. Her eyes, unfocused. Around her, the shadows flicker, not from torchlight, but from movement. Small, deliberate movement. Flies. They gather at her hem. At her sleeves. At the place where the fabric pulls away from the skin. They do not fear her. They know what she is. They know what she's become. They always did. Behind her, the stained glass windows cast red light on the floor, as if the sun itself had been soaked in blood. The courtiers stand frozen, unmoving, as if still waiting for a command. But there is none. There never was. Only the weight of her vow, still pressing down on the room, even after she is gone. No one dares speak. Because silence was her true inheritance. And even now, centuries later, the room still holds its breath. The queen who refused to change her linen did not just wage a war, she rewrote what righteousness looked like. She did not purify a kingdom, she infected it. She did not suffer for salvation, she made suffering the condition for power. She changed history. But not in the way she thought. And now you know. Now you carry the stench of the truth. Cursed Chronicles doesn't look away when history gets filthy. Subscribe, and let the clean historians argue about fairy tales in the comments.